Kia ora Aotearoa, welcome to Waatea for the State, New Zealand's only multi-platform current affairs program where we rank the most important news events with the best political commentators in New Zealand. Streaming live on waateanews.com, thedailyblog.nz and broadcasting live on Face TV Sky Channel 83. Joining us tonight to discuss what has gone wrong in public broadcasting and are TVNZ and Radio New Zealand doing enough to live up to their fourth estate and treaty obligations. Program leader of Pacifika journalism at AUT, Richard Pamatatau, Waatea English news editor Adam Gifford, and AUT communications lecturer and media commentator Dr. Wayne Hope, and via Skype from Dunedin, the Labour Party spokesperson on broadcasting, Clare Curran. We'll also wrap the show with a final word from our panellist, but let's get stuck into the issue of the night. Public broadcasting has rotted on the vine under 8 years of national. Does the government want a compliant media, and are Radio New Zealand and TVNZ even doing their bit for their treaty and fourth estate obligations? I want to start by looking at research Waatea undertook to show that Radio New Zealand play a pathetic level of Maori content. Richard, is the strangling off of Indigenous voices structural racism, and does it impact the entire Pacific?
Well, it's structural racism for a start. It's Eurocentric programming. It affects not only the Pacific, it affects New Zealand, because what we're seeing, viewing, consuming tells us how to think, or how we should be thinking, and RNZ, as the leading public broadcaster, has a really important role to play with the way it portrays, with the way it structures, with the way it often stereotypes sections of the population.
If public broadcasters aren't living up to their treaty obligations, can there be any expectation that private media would pick it up?
Well, there can be some explanation. There could be an expectation there, but I think what's more important is discussing what is a public broadcaster as the population changes. We are used to RNZ as a public broadcaster, but actually there are sections of the population who don't listen to RNZ. They're the people maybe who are listening to Hum FM or 531 PI,
sure,
or Radio Samoa, who might not speak English. So we need to have a conversation around what a public broadcaster is as broadcasting shifts and changes.
Do you think that some of the criticism towards Radio New Zealand is unfair, in that they have to try and operate in a market, they're trying to put popular content forward, they might argue Maori content doesn't rate?
And they might argue that, but who cares? We are talking about public broadcasting, and here's an example of where that kind of content needs some work. I was listening to the Arts on Sunday on the weekend. There was a review of the Samoan film, and the film reviewer said, I've only just discovered Andrew Faleatua, who is the composer. So actually it's a unidirectional approach to other people's lives. It's looking at other people and saying, I discovered them, and that whole I discover notion is deeply problematic, because these people don't need to be discovered by somebody who's a film reviewer.
Right. Do you think that with mainstream media, if they don't take an obvious step towards having more voices included in their panel discussions and the way we talk about politics, then what you're doing in effect is getting a very one-sided narrative of what's going on in society?
Well, that's obvious, and we hear that all the time. We hear it when we listen to the panel. We hear it on Morning Report, we hear it on Checkpoint, and that's not necessarily because people don't want to include other voices, but there's a process that sits around making the news, and we recognise that.
Claire, former TVNZ executive Rick Ellis once infamously claimed TVNZ were living up to their treaty obligations by screening Police 10-7 because so many criminals caught on the show were Maori. Is the Maori voice doomed to be ghettoised in public broadcasting?
Well, I certainly think having a conversation about what a public broadcaster is would really help clarify and enable there to be some real debate about this. And I think, yes, under the way that the current funding is structured, and the way that pretty much all our media is heading, then I certainly think that there are voices that are being ghettoised and squashed, really. So I think there are some real problems. I think we talked about structural racism. I think there are major structural problems in the way that our media operates. Real public broadcasting is diminishing day by day, and that is a real problem.
Why is it that we don't seem to have any time for a Maori identifiable voice, a Pacific Island identifiable voice. We seem to have a very, very, very small strata of people who are allowed to even be on television.
Yeah, well, I think that's, you know, the Americanization of television, where ratings seem to rule, and that is there's a creep into Radio New Zealand, into RNZ on that as well.
Yeah.
However, in saying that, I am going to stick up for them a bit, because I do think that they are doing a job under very difficult circumstances.
Yep.
There's an envelope that is being, a funding envelope, which has been the same since 2009.
Yep.
And they are trying to adapt to a multi-platform environment, and of course something's got to give. And they got questioned in a select committee just a week or so ago.
Yep.
Very defensive.
Yep.
And really, what is really concerning is that the chair revealed that they haven't even gone and asked the government for more money in this budget round. And why is that? Is that, and they were asked, has RNZ given up? Well, I think that's a good question.
Adam, what happens to our society when racists like Mike Hosking and Paul Henry dominate the media?
That's Radio Live. That's Willie's employer, and that's ZB.
Willie just turned up.
Kia ora, Willie. And really, I think put them to one side. The problem we have is actually the soft racism of Radio New Zealand and the institutional racism. You know what you're getting when you get Paul Henry. You know what you're getting with Mike Hosking. But it's that more subtle racism about who you choose to put on the panel, the way you frame things, and the way that stories are framed. Like, who is their audience? And the problem that I had when I was working in Radio New Zealand, probably that Richard had, is that they don't think that they're going to be talking to anyone but white people. The demographics out there, the people who pay their taxes, who expect the public broadcasting, there's a whole bunch of brown people who want say there, and they're not getting it.
Do you think it's acceptable someone like Mike Hosking, with the opinions that he is so happy to share, should be on TVNZ? That is the public broadcaster. No,
I don't think that. I think that having a public frequency is a right, whether you're TV3, Media Works, or TVNZ. The actual frequencies, the spectrum is a public right. There should be some public duty. We've lost that. We've lost that. The whole charter debate fell apart because people couldn't actually sort of see the linkage between what you have to get your message out and the obligations you may owe to society as part of that.
Wayne, we have deep problems in the broadcasting landscape of New Zealand, political and economic. Large corporations taking over media companies and then chopping up the assets are the new commercial forces shaping our news. How similar is MediaWorks' position to that of Dick Smith, who just shut down, costing 400 jobs?
It's not identical, but there are very close analogies. There's no question about that. One of the big trends in media ownership in New Zealand over the last 5 years has been private equity companies and banks moving in to own media companies that used to be more dominated by media moguls. Mm-hmm. Like, some viewers might be surprised to know that Rupert Murdoch has nothing to do with Sky Television anymore, right? Mm-hmm. Now, what's happened with MediaWorks is it is now, at present, owned by a private equity fund called Oaktree. Mm-hmm. And what they did when they took it over is that they instituted a completely different business model. And that business model had no room for news and current affairs, none whatsoever. It's built around, obviously, a reality TV model and around light tabloid style of news and current affairs, which is not news and current affairs, even though they use that fig leaf. And what's happened, ironically enough, is that their revenue's not great. Their ratings are not great. I mean, the last few weeks of the Campbell show were doing far better than what their shows are doing now. Yeah. And the logic of it is that private equity companies are only interested in short-term profit. So we could see the television part of the equation, which is not as profitable as the radio part of MediaWorks, broken up in the next few years, and then they just concentrate on the radio. Well, that's appalling.
I think I'm getting tired of you running down my MediaWorks mates, but anyway, we'll...
No, it's not your mates, it's the people who got the purse strings against.
Well, some of them are my mates. I want to come back to the taxpayer-funded RNZ, because you know, we started this research in terms of what they're doing for Maori. And do you think, in terms of, because we've worked out, and Adam, and we've seen it all, it's 2%. 2% they've, from their own reports in terms of Maori news in the last 12 months. Should they be put on a quota, do you think?
Quota is not a bad idea. A quota is a good idea.
Right.
Because let's look at the amount of time business has.
Yeah.
10 minutes in the morning. Do
That's
we
right.
need that?
Yeah.
Or let's have 10 minutes of Maori or other news.
Farming news.
Yeah, exactly.
The birds.
The
The birds.
So let's make it a
Because
a thing.
I interviewed the CEO this morning, Paul Thompson, and he says, look, we want to mix it all up. And I think his intentions might be good, and Carol Hirschfield's intentions are good. The problem is when they disappear, we've got nothing. Isn't that a fact, Adam?
What Paul Thompson also said to you is, we're going to have more, but it'll probably be digital. It'll probably be online.
Yes.
That's a cop-out. Radio is about minutes. That's why the commercial jocks fight to have minutes to sell.
Are we right, Adam, to ask for a slice of the action as a treaty partner? Are we right to ask for a slice of the action? Like a Maori voice.
The last time there was a kind of a treaty partnership in Radio New Zealand was with Hinare Te Ua and Te Reo Aotearoa.
Yes.
And he had his own section. When I started working with Radio New Zealand, and I was not under him, deliberately they'd sort of taken the Maori news reporter away from his section. And he told me, he said, look, we've spent 20 years building this up, don't get in our way.
But these politicians, they're not interested, Richard.
But he had it, and he had his...
The politicians are not interested. We've alerted the politicians for years. Fox has called them Pākehā Radio 5-6 years ago. But these guys in Parliament, Ururo Flavel's showing some interest.
It's too hard
We're totally shut out of our national provider. We're just shut out.
And you have been for years, and look at who's presenting the shows. So it's white people, isn't it?
Yes.
When is there going to be somebody who isn't a white person
Your
hosting
people.
the show?
There's another dimension to this, Willie, and that is that commercially driven racism is just as bad as the old structural kind in the days of the monocultural state. And by commercial racism, I mean Maori programming going on graveyard slots in TVNZ. Now you think about it, if Maori television was entirely dependent on advertising revenue, then you wouldn't be able to run the programs that they do, right?
No.
So I argue that having a space for non-commercial broadcasting is a prerequisite for developing a bicultural sensibility across our airwaves.
Clare,
you can't have one without the other.
Clare, if we look at the assault on journalism by this government over the last 8 years, it's not a pretty picture. The harassment of Bradley Ambrose, the shutting down of TVNZ 6 and 7 using fake ratings numbers, the smear campaign against John Stevenson, the attacks and illegal search of Nikki Haga, the attack on Glenn Greenwald and Edward Snowden, and the killing off of Campbell Lyon for political reasons. How dangerous to a democracy is a compliant and frightened media?
Massively, massively dangerous. And, what we're seeing is absolute erosion of democracy at the moment. Can I just make a comment about what Willie said about the mixing it up, what Paul Thompson said about the mixing it up? What I think we're seeing is the same model that New Zealand On Air has been using for mixing it up with publicly funded content across all of the different platforms, the commercial platforms, as their way of justifying, oh look, there's public interest broadcasting across all these platforms. But what happens is that a lot of these programs, such as Q&A, The Nation, whatever, actually get put on at times when there's hardly any audiences, because it's the commercial interests that drive the ratings around when the programs are shown. So you're never going to get those sorts of programs, whether it's Maori, Pacific, whatever, being put on in primetime television, which is what we need to be demanding, and which is where decent, any public broadcaster that's worth its salt, no matter what, whether it's radio or television, should be taking that stuff seriously. So, this is getting really, really serious. And, Bomber, we've been saying this for a long time, ever since we walked behind that coffin of TVNZ 7 when it was, on the last day of its life.
Can I make a point about that?
Damn serious what's happening into broadcasting in this country.
When the last Labor government, a very good thing too, provided funding for TVNZ 7, what they didn't do is provide any legislative underpinning for that.
Yes.
Right.
Now, even if a new national government was going to get rid of it, at least they would have had to do so in the full public glare. But because that legislative underpinning wasn't there, they could almost do it by stealth, given how commercial the media is, and they don't really run stories like that anyway. And I thought that was a welcome initiative by the Labor government, but that lack of legislative underpinning made it really easy for our opponents just to flick it off.
And I'll cop that. I think fair cop, and is that is that it should have been stronger, and that it's a lesson learned.
But the thing is, Clare,
you've got to keep the politicians away from decisions about what is broadcast, though.
No, but Clare, you guys should actually get involved, because while you're great talking about TV7 and all that, the Maori interests have been forgotten. Maori interests are always forgotten by politicians like yourself. All right. Otherwise, you would have got involved years ago, Clare. Richard, our interests are always forgotten. Well, you look at the music quotas from way back. No quotas for Maori music or anything like that.
Always on the side.
Always on the side.
And just
Willie, with respect, Labor's had quite substantial policy around broadcasting the last 2 elections.
Yeah.
We're working on strong policy now. I want you to get involved.
No. Well, I've been involved and I couldn't break through because we still ended up at 2%, Richard, and
exactly.
you know this.
And that's not going to change without really active work by Labor. And also let's note that Labor didn't exactly do RNZ any favours when you were in power for 9 years.
Yeah.
The budget didn't do RNZ.
I mean,
any
Adam is an expert on this. He's worked at RNZ. He works for me. He works for us in terms of Maori media. You're probably best placed to look at this better than anyone. Is Maori broadcasting forgotten in the whole argument? Is it more like, well, you've got the Maori TV, you've got the Maori radio, see you later, Maoris?
It is that structural thing, and it is that who their audience is, who they're addressing, and they're not looking at the demographics. The reality is, we do have 15% of the population being Maori, and in terms of the younger demographic, a lot more. They're trying to go for a younger demographic, but they're not aiming for the Maori
Clare,
demographic.
in all the panel, 91 years National Radio has been going. Not one Maori front person in the prime time.
And they're not bringing in the people. They talk about bringing these people in.
That's an indictment, isn't it, on this broadcaster? Henare Tua, Derek Fox, Julian Wilcox, Mihi Forbes, Shane Todima. No one good enough to front a primetime show, Richard.
Well, see, part of their problem, I think, is they took the news in-house about 5 or 6 years ago after outsourcing for 15
That's right,
years.
we had it, yeah.
But they couldn't, all those years, they couldn't actually get a senior Maori journalist to come and work with them, either because they weren't offering enough or because the conditions were too onerous, that people didn't feel that they would have the rangatiratanga within the organisation to make a difference.
We've looked at the Maori strategy. Have we looked at the Maori strategy? They want to train their journalists to learn Maori, Bomber. Well, that's great, isn't it? At the taxpayer's expense, Bomber?
Well, that's I think pronunciation and understanding the kaupapa, but that's all very, very, very important things. But surely, if it's Radio New Zealand, which is the official voice of New Zealand, a broadcaster who has responsibility for archiving our history, people and historians look back to listen and see, well, what were the perspectives, what were the thoughts, and if it is leaving out the Maori voice completely,
I think TVNZ's track record is even worse.
Right. Hang on, at least we've got Maori news on TVNZ. We've got no news. We've got nothing, Wayne, on Radio New Zealand.
I reiterate my previous point, a lot of graveyard slots. If we look at things historically, what happened was, with the establishment of Maori television, that was really, I believe, one of the major accomplishments of the Maori cultural renaissance and political renaissance in the 60s and 70s. Rangi Walker was real in support of that, right? Yep. But at the same time as those successes were happening, the rest of the country was going down the Rogernomics route, the euthanasia route, and the country as a whole was becoming more and more commercialised. And so what's happened as a result of that is that Maori television has had to carry the burden of being a te reo broadcaster and a public broadcaster through no fault of its own. And the only response to this that'll work, as I said before, you've got to open up the commercial media space for non-commercial public media.
Richard,
we need to come back to what is a public broadcaster. My colleague Saravui Talatu's father doesn't listen to RNZ. He listens to Radio Samoa because it's in Samoa.
Sure.
The Niuean population listens to the Niuean program.
Yep.
So for them, public broadcasting is not RNZ and beautifully enunciated tones and the book of the week and the wine of the week and the recipe of the week. It's what's going on within their population.
So should they be getting 35 million, Richard? That's the question.
Well, and yes, they should be.
They shouldn't be.
RNZ,
yes.
no. We need to
That's
think how that money is placed out there, because At 5:31 PI, it's voluntary labour.
Yes, yes.
Voluntary labour.
Yes.
Wayne, the new head, I just want to get this in at this point. The new head of news at TV3 believes worthy journalism should die in favour of clickbait. Is it academic snobbery to try and tell people what to want to see if all they want to see is kitten videos?
Well, my understanding is that the hit rates for this particular program last week were very, very high.
Oh, well, yeah, they were.
My understanding is that the overall, the ratings numbers for Campbell were pretty good.
Yeah.
I think that clickbait argument, I think one of the problems there is that in the commercial media world, a lot of advertising has moved online. So if you work for APN News or some other newsroom, it means you're actually competing against operators where the ad spend is going to them like Facebook and Google.
Right.
And so therefore young journos are expected to put up stories which compete with the latest Kardashian video.
Right.
And so that is the ultimate hyper-commercialisation of the system. And that's really insidious.
Richard?
Well, people actually, I think, want more and better. It's like saying McDonald's is all you can eat. Nobody wants that.
Yeah.
And it's like eating fat all the time. Now we're having this debate about a fat tax. You need to provide people with high quality content to lift the content.
I think as somebody who's sort of worked in journalism a long time, I'm not going to second guess what story takes off. Sometimes I'm surprised. Sometimes I know that a story's wacky enough it'll take off.
Yeah.
Sometimes I will put a story up sometimes I put a story up that I think this is a bit geeky and serious and all about legislation, and it'll go off. There'll be sort of a lot of comments because you tap into something. You know, our stories on Maori land reform, people really go for those.
Claire, do we risk having just a clickbait new rating system that is going to decide what actually gets the headline now?
Yes, we do. But I'd like to say that there's always going to be a place for quality journalism and for analysis and debate. And I think New Zealanders are hungering for that, and that there isn't enough of it. And congratulations on you for providing some good discussion and some more content for people to watch. It's the sort of thing that we need to be doing more of. We need to be giving people opportunities. And doing it in a way where they can either watch it live or they can watch it later or they can link to it on Twitter or whatever. You know, that's not the issue. The thing is that it's got to be public. It's, you know, we've got to give people things that they know that they can trust that there aren't commercial interests driving it, so that they can use that as a measure for the other discussions that are going on the Paul Henrys or the Mike Hoskings or whatever.
Willie and Ellie. That's a pretty good show too. Well, we're in the wind down. So what's the solution then, Clare, in terms of a better public broadcasting vehicle?
Well, more investment in public broadcasting, particularly in public broadcasting television in this country, which is non-existent, pretty much non-existent, and making sure that that is, like somebody pointed out earlier, that there's, you know, it can't be easily dismantled.
Do we need quotas? Because
Well,
I'm talking about the Maori news element, Maori language. Do we need does Radio News, do we have to impose a quota on RNZ?
We've got to come up with a mechanism, whether you call it a quota or whatever. You've got to come up with a mechanism for true representation, and I'm absolutely committed to that.
Thank you, Claire. Wayne?
Well, the first thing for Radio New Zealand is we have to stop it being financially strangled, because these cultural initiatives that we're all talking about are never going to get off the ground the way the government is treating it now. Now, as far as advancing public broadcasting, I would advocate selling TV2, turning TV1 into a public broadcaster, and then supporting that with legislation. I support Labour's position on increasing the funding for RNZ. I think we could do a lot more with the parliamentary channel and fill it up with the kind of stuff that used to be on TVNZ. And I think New Zealand On Air should broaden its remit to support programs like this.
Richard?
That is a good idea. NZAir broaden its remit, but not just more funding for RNZ, more funding for 531 PI, for the Pacific Media Network, that speaks to a whole other audience that might not speak English the way that RNZ does, and actually politicians engaging more actively in this conversation.
You've still got Pacific Island News, haven't you? Is there Pacific Island News on national radio?
No, it's gone.
That's gone too?
It's integrated like everything.
They got rid of the islanders too, eh?
I want to see Radio New Zealand have a host on one of their mainline shows every day of the week who's a Maori. I want to see when they try people out in the holidays to see who might shape up. I don't want to hear the Irish voice anymore. I want to hear some Maori being tried out to sort of see if they make the grade.
And don't tell us we don't have the talent.
If they don't invest in the talent, if they don't look for the talent, they won't find the talent.
And actually, just to extend that, I don't want to hear another Pacific Island story where something happens and they say, let's talk to the community leaders, because I have not heard a single financial story where they say some directors wrecked a company, let's talk to the community leaders. And when you use those analogies, islanders can't do this, but, you know, finance people are white and they can't run finance companies. Let's just...
Hey, look, thanks very much. I just want to, in the last couple of minutes, pay tribute to Rangi Nui Walker. Yes. Well, you covered him for years, Adam.
Actually, there's a good example. When I was working at Radio New Zealand, I used Rangi Walker sparingly. Very valuable talent, especially with things that he knew about. But by that stage, he'd stopped being the chair of the Auckland Māori District Māori Council anymore. And so, you know, I went for things that I knew he had a specialist interest in. When I left, suddenly it was Rangi all the time because they didn't know any other Māoris to go to.
Which is what they, you know, do too often, because people like me are on too often. That's just the reality. But he was such a fighter. I was quite humbled, actually. Mihi Forbes got in touch with me before the show tonight and said she'd visited Deirdre, his wife, and she had said to Mihi that they had listened to my debate with Carol Hirschfield on Radio New Zealand yesterday, just before Rangi died. So that was she thought it was a lovely way for Rangi Nui to go out. You know, he was a great fighter for our people, a fantastic advocate. He inspired so many of us through the years. My father, Bob Jackson, was his deputy chair, and you know, I suppose we'll never forget his contribution. Derek Fox said today that he was a warrior, but a warrior with the head and a warrior with the pen. And
don't forget Deirdre too. I mean, her facilitation, her support for that man was extraordinary over the years.
That's
he
right.
had a very acerbic turn of phrase.
He was, well, that's right.
He used to call the Colonization Nation myth the Weet-Bix history of New Zealand.
Absolutely fearless and absolute warrior. So we want to thank the panellists and thank you, Whānau, for watching us on waateanews.com, the daily blog.co.nz and Face TV, Sky Channel 83. And as I said, in terms of Rangi Nui, I suppose I was humbled to have known him, humbled to have followed him. He was a great leader and an inspiration in terms of te ao Māori. Nō reire e te rangatira, aha ko kua haere koe, ka noho tētahi wahi o koe i ngā wainga nui i a mātou. Nō reire e te rangatira, moi mai, moi mai, moi mai rā.